authoritarian rule. Democracy overall, according to the survey, declined in more than 2/3 of the world's countries in 2020, as COVID-related lockdowns led to a huge rollback of civil liberties. Public trust in democracy has declined. Populism has gained ground. But most of you watching this event today know these things. Many of you joining us today are elected parliamentarians and witness these things firsthand. The question for us today is whether democracy itself, in a historical sense, is truly in crisis. And if so, what can be done about it? Before I introduce my panel, a word about the International Parliamentary Union. As many of you know, the IPU, the Global Organization of National Parliaments, was founded more than 130 years ago. It's the world's first multilateral political organization. Today, it has 179 member parliaments and works for the 46,000 parliamentarians in the world. And if today is the International Day of Democracy, it's because the IPU initiated and established this day through a UNGA resolution in 2007. That's why we're gathered here. Some quick housekeeping notes. There's live translation for this event. You can click on the interpretation button on the control panel, and that should enable you to toggle between English and French. Second, we've earmarked 45 minutes, so about half of our total time, to take questions from our global audience on Zoom. It's very simple. Click on the Q&A button, type in your name, where you're writing from, and your question, direct it to one of our guests, and I'll either bring you into the conversation if that's possible, or I'll try and ask the question on your behalf. Feel free to also leave comments and discuss our topic on the Zoom chat. So without further ado now, let's bring in our panelists. Hélène Landemore is a professor of political science at Yale University. She's the author of Democratic Reason, published in 2013, and Open Democracy, published last year. Hélène, welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Jan-Werner Mueller is the Roger William Straus Professor of Social Sciences at Princeton University. His books include Democracy Rules, published in 2021, and What is Populism, published in 2016. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Our pleasure. And finally, Martin Chungong. He's the Secretary General of the IPU. He made history in 2014 by becoming the first African and first non-European to be elected to his role. He has more than 3 decades of experience and knowledge of parliaments at national and international levels. Martin, welcome.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. I'm very glad to be here today.
Likewise, it's a real pleasure to have you with us and to be able to convene this panel. So let's get started. We'll have about 45 minutes of Q&A among ourselves, and then we'll bring in, as I said, questions from our global audience, as well as from the many hundreds of parliamentarians who are with us today. Jan, I'm going to start with you, and my question is quite simple, just to frame things. Is democracy in crisis?
Simple question, not quite so simple an answer, I'm afraid. So at the risk of sounding very pedantic, I would break it down into 3 dimensions. There is crisis in the more traditional sense of a sort of basically life or death moment, when it's very obvious and visible whether a political system is still able to process conflict in a democratic way or something else is going on. So just imagine tanks rolling out in the streets. As you said, Ravi, at the beginning of our session today, that's still happening in the world. That's not, a purely 20th century phenomenon, but that's only one dimension. The second one is the sort of much more gradual hollowing out of existing democracies, often through legal means. What a colleague of mine, Kim Shepley, has called autocratic legalism, which is a very drawn-out process, very often very hard to notice, because even the individual elements of this hollowing out of democracy can look quite innocent by themselves. But if you look at the larger picture, all of a sudden you realize aspiring autocrats have created a situation where a real turnover of power is no longer possible. So that's dimension number 2. And dimension number 3 is the decline of democracy, even in very consolidated democracies where some elements are hardly visible, but where since about 2008, you alluded to this, we've basically had a fairly clear trend that according to most think tanks, criteria, etc., something bad is clearly happening. And that can take multiple manifestations. It can be things like attacks on journalists, which we didn't see in previous eras. It's rising socioeconomic equality. It's a very complex picture, but the trend, alas, is clear. So all these, I think, can plausibly be called crises, but we shouldn't mix them up, and we should always be careful in terms of what exactly we're looking for. If I may add one more word, if you were to push me sort of who's to blame, I think it's important to resist the temptation to basically blame the people themselves. I think this has been very strong for a certain type of, in the largest possible sense of that word, liberal, who sometimes sort of has been inclined to basically recycle cliches from 19th century mass psychology. The people are so irrational, they're all waiting to be seduced by the great demagogue, and so on. I don't think that's a plausible explanation. And those of our colleagues who point at surveys and say, oh, people are losing faith in democracy, I'm not sure that's right. They might not like the kinds of democracies that are on offer in particular countries. But I don't see any evidence to say that, oh, people are comprehensively turning away from democratic ideal, and they clearly prefer to live under authoritarians. There's no evidence for that.
Got it. So democracy is in crisis. It's complicated, but don't blame the people. And then I'm going to ask you a similar question. As someone who's studied democratic movements around the world across history, how do you place the state of democracy today in 2021 in a historical sense?
I would say that, perhaps instead of speaking of a crisis, I would speak of a chronic illness that has been masked maybe for decades by, the expansion of the franchise or certain things like economic growth during the early phase of globalization maybe. But ultimately we've reached the realization that democracy as we've built it since the 18th century is not meeting the promises of people's power. And you can see it in, I would say there are two criteria by which I would diagnose the acuteness of the crisis now, which are one, the lack of correspondence between what people want and what they get. So this is measured by political scientists like Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page, who show that public policies are not responsive to, are not correlated to what people want, except when they overlap with, what the 10% richest in the population want. So that's in the US context, but I'm pretty sure you could map that out in other countries as well. And the other criterion is approval rates of politician parties, parliaments around advanced democracies. Again, to take the US, which is maybe a more extreme case, but it's a magnifying glass for the predicament elsewhere. Since we are measuring these kind of things since 1971, the approval rate of the American Congress has never been higher than 30%. How is that acceptable? How are we okay with that? Not to mention that it reaches lows like 9% in November 2013. I mean, I don't think the system is doing well. People don't think it's that legitimate after all. There's a crisis of legitimacy going on at a deep level.
A crisis in legitimacy, and thank you for the numbers there as well. Let me just bring in Martin as well before we dive in a bit deeper. Martin, from your perch as Secretary General of the IPU, what are the challenges you hear from parliamentarians around the world?
Yeah, thank you, Ravi. I think that I would like to use one moment to go back to the question of whether or not democracy is in crisis.
Please.
I want to give a bit of positive twist to the conversation and say that, in my view, democracy is not in a crisis. If you look at it in terms of democracy being a set of values and principles and ideals that are universally recognized, I think the issues of freedom, participation in public institutions, and all of that are still topical today, and people are not challenging that. What is in crisis are the institutions, the practices of democracy. And I think my previous speakers have mentioned that there's lack of trust in institutions and not in democracy per se. So for me, I would like for us to distinguish between democracy as a system of values and ideals and democracy as institutions and people who have been called upon to give expression to that democracy. And that's the democracy, I think, is in the crisis, because when all those countries that you mentioned, those instances you mentioned, yeah, it is those institutions that have been called into question and abolished, parliaments, political parties, constitutions, and all of that, because there's dissatisfaction. And if we agreed on that, then we can also talk about democracy not being a finite thing. It is always work in progress. And that is the beauty of democracy, that you keep working at it and you never take it for granted. And that's why we think it's fragile. Coming back to parliaments, I think that the picture that we see of parliaments is that they are resilient. Parliaments in this 21st century have grown in terms of maturity. That was not the case, I think, in the early 90s when many parliaments were coming into re-existence. But then they are challenged because in many systems, there is the dominance of the executive arm of government. Parliament do not have a free hand. They're beholden to certain interests, whether they're monetary, financial, or otherwise. Then they're also victims. Parliamentarians are also victims of arbitrary action, coercive action by certain actors, be it government or state, called state actors. And that is why we have this major problem in the IPU, where we want to defend the rights of parliamentarians, not because they are above the law, but because we want to defend the integrity of the parliamentary institution. And then you also have the basic challenge of resources. Often the executive arm is better resourced than parliament, because of course, in many societies, you don't want parliament breathing down your throat. You don't want an efficient parliament. You don't want a spoil spot. And that is the problem that many parliaments are facing today, especially the younger parliaments or parliaments that are operating in a situation of crisis. They are cash trapped, they are resource trapped, and we need to recognize this when we set about building democratic institutions. So I would say generally that parliaments have continued to be resilient, and we've seen this during the pandemic. There's been the digital divide, of course, but our assessment is that parliaments have not been locked down during the COVID, which is a good sign that this is an institution that is very much needed in our dispensation today.
I hear you, Martin. It's a good point that the institutions of democracy are struggling, the leaders are struggling, but the ideals are intact in a sense. But I also sense there may be some disagreement here among our panelists. So Hélène, can I bring you in on that? And I guess the question is that if the practice of democracy is struggling, but not the ideals, doesn't the mispractice or bad outcomes, don't they then end up impacting the ideals themselves?
Yes, exactly. I think that's also what's happening. I think we can distinguish between the practice and the ideal, but to the extent that we identify the ideal with certain practices like periodic elections, if those do not deliver the goods, good governance, legitimacy and responsiveness and things like that, then it will affect the ideal. And in fact, that's what we're seeing. People are not voting anymore. There's a lot more apathy. They're not engaging with parties the way they used to do. So the hollowing out is real, and it's partly because the ideal itself is at stake for some people. I'm not saying that's the case everywhere. And in fact, my observation of democratic experiments and innovations around the world also suggests that there's a rise of democratic expectations, and that people are really eager to enrich the ideal. And as was said before, sort of continue this work in progress that is democracy. But so we are at a point where indeed I think there needs to be work done around the idea of, well, what does democracy mean? Again, this is a question we constantly have to ask ourselves. And I think, to me, at least at this point, it no longer means just free and fair periodic elections. And it doesn't even mean, and that's going to be the more provocative sort of statement here in this context, especially an elected parliament. In fact, when I see some comments suggesting that we need a world democracy and at the global level have some kind of elected parliament, I just think we're going to, if we do that, we're going to replicate the vices of the current system. This is going to be highly unrepresentative of the larger population. It will cost a fortune to run elections at that level. And so we're going to end up with an even more oligarchic version of what we have at the national level. So my suggestion would be to go back to the Greeks to some degree and rethink what we mean by democratic representation and decenter elected institutions, including parliaments, and recenter ordinary citizens and what I call a form of lotocratic democratic representation, whereas the legislative work is actually done by randomly selected citizens in connection with the larger public via multiple methods, and of course with moments of referenda to sanction the whole thing. So it's a pretty radical re-envisioning of what democracy means, but I think we're at a point where nothing should be off the table.
Yeah, I think it's a good point to make, and I'm sure our parliamentarians listening around the world are hearing you when you say that democracy isn't just about elections. And just a reminder, please, if you're listening in from anywhere in the world, you can send in questions on the Zoom chat button, the Q&A button, type it in, tell us who you are, where you're writing in from, and I will try and put some of the best questions to our panelists later in this event. We'll also hear from many parliamentarians around the world. Jan, just following on from what Hélène just said, you've written extensively about populists, including in your last book, Democracy Rules. And I was struck that you say in general that populists claim that they, and only they, represent what they often refer to as the real people, or sometimes the silent majority. And those words, I alone can fix it, probably sound very familiar to many of us. You also say that the model of populists is to divide citizens as much as possible. Sounds kind of anti-democratic, and yet populists are now gaining ground in some of the world's most populous countries. Why?
So the problem is, if you invite professors, you're always going to get long, complicated answers to simple questions. It's sort of an irony for me, at least, that we, again, if I may, in the broadest sense, liberals, we always say, oh, the populists, they are the great simplifiers, the world is complex. But if somebody could give us the answer to this question in 140 or maximum 280 characters, we'd be very happy. But I'm afraid to say that even though, as you rightly say, the outcomes can look very similar. So if you look at, Erdogan, Modi, Bolsonaro, Trump, etc., the style of governance, the style of rhetoric, all looks very similar. But it doesn't quite follow from that the rise of all these actors has exactly the same causes. It'd be very simple if we could simply say, oh, it's all economic or it's all cultural. I think we still have to do the hard work of looking very closely at specific national contexts. We have to see what the initial problems were. I mean, just because populists, indeed, in my view, have a kind of authoritarian tendency, it doesn't follow that everything they've ever said is a lie or is made up, etc. Obviously, some of these actors did get a foothold initially because they did point at very real problems, and they were right to say that certain parts of the population were neglected, ignored, mistreated, whatever it might be. But the similarities, I think, are not due to the fact that the cause is exactly identical everywhere. It's much more about the fact that a lot of these actors can actually learn from each other. And I think this, in a certain way, unsettles what I think was a genuine post-Cold War illusion. Not that history had ended. I don't think any of us really believe that. But what I think we did believe was that democracies constantly make mistakes. We constantly screw up. But we are the only learning system. We are the only system that has a kind of epistemic advantage of learning from mistakes, correcting mistakes, and so on. And that's not wrong, but it doesn't quite follow that, to put it bluntly, all the authoritarians are stupid and they're all going to end like the Soviet Union in 1991. We can all think of countries, including very big countries in this world, where the leaders are obsessed with exactly the question of what went wrong in the Soviet Union. So obviously, the Politburo in Beijing thinks about nothing else, but how can we avoid making the same mistakes? It doesn't follow that these new authoritarian regimes are invincible or that nothing can be done. I'm not saying that. But I worry that if in doubt, we still kind of underestimate their capacity for learning, their capacity to basically copy, I was going to say best practices, but of course, in a certain sense, they're worst practices along the lines of, somebody comes up with a relatively innocent looking law that de facto serves to intimidate civil society. That kind of stuff is easy to copy across borders. And we have seen a lot of that happening in the last couple of years. Now, I know that this absolutely did not answer your question, but I hope it was halfway interesting anyway.
No, it's insightful, Jan. And let me bring Martin in on this because Martin, Jan sort of referred to Frank Fukuyama's book, The End of History, and there's sort of a smugness to that kind of an argument because it implies that this system that we have of democracy and capitalism and the systems that we've built around it is perfect, or at the very least that it is now, set in stone and better than all the other alternatives out there, to use sort of the Churchill quote now. But given all of that, Martin, doesn't that feeling of smugness, that feeling of staticness, doesn't that then open a window for populists, for potential autocrats to then say, well, how about this model? Or as Jan put it, to sort of follow worst practices instead of the best ones?
I think that populism plays on the fears of the people. And this is a manifestation of the failings of democracy, in the sense that we're having a hard time establishing a strong link between what we consider to be abstract values and principles and ideals and real outcomes. And what do people aspire to? They want to enjoy freedom. They want to enjoy the possibility of participating in the governance of their society. And by the same token, they want to have a better life in terms of welfare and education, whatever, health, and all of that. And that is where I think that democracy has failed in many societies. Those people, those institutions that are called upon to implement democracy have failed to deliver to the people at the end of the day. And so there is a breach that the populists have gone into very happily, and they're staying there. But I do think that we cannot afford to be complacent about democracy. It would be wrong for us to think that democracy is perfect. I don't think it's perfect. It's always, as I said before, work in progress. We have to keep working at it and not fall prey to those people who would divert democracy. And if I go back to what I said about resilience, the very fact that the US Congress could meet a few hours after the invasion of Capitol Hill by the rioters shows that the institution of parliament itself can still be trusted, and it is resilient, and they look up to it to make change in society. And we cannot just simply ignore that. But again, as I say, it would be wrong for us to rest on our laurels and say we have a perfect democracy. And so I don't agree with the term full democracy. There's no full democracy. If there were full democracy, and we would think that America in those terms is a full democracy, what happened on the 6th of January would not have happened, because it's a perfect democracy. So we need to continue working on this and not leave the field open to populists, because at the end of the day, I'm afraid there are those authoritarian tendencies that come to the fore, and it's difficult to get rid of.
Thank you, Martin. I appreciate your sort of optimistic perspective, especially on January 6th. That's a perspective we don't hear enough about. But you brought up the need to sort of see democracy evolve, to see it change, to see it as something that's dynamic. And I think this is a great moment to bring Hélène back in, because in her book, Open Democracy, which I urge everyone watching here today to read, she describes how Iceland tried to redesign its constitution. And Hélène, I'm wondering if you can tell everyone a little bit about that process as we begin now to discuss ways in which to revitalize and reform and change democracy as it evolves.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. Before I do that, though, I would like to add a word about populism. Populism, for me, it's a reaction to elitism, and sometimes it's worse than the problem. It's a perceived corrective that may solve nothing. But it has a diagnostic value. It tells us that if there is a lot of populism, it's probably because there's too much elitism in the existing institutions. And my worry is that the elitism of our current system, the fact that it overrepresents the interests of the wealthy, the well-positioned, etc., it's not a bug, it is a feature that was encoded in the design decisions we made as societies in the 18th century by choosing elections as a way to select our representatives. So my worry, unlike Martin, I'm not so optimistic that we just have to keep at it and just deepen our institutions and all will be well eventually. We've already been doing this for 200 years and we're now in this predicament. So I worry that actually the path is not to deepen, but to change the paradigm and to, not saying to replace and abolish elected parliaments, but to at least consider that we need a new source of legitimacy and wisdom, which is not and will never be found in elected officials. And that source of wisdom is in, ordinary citizens. And if we can't consult them or involve them en masse, then we have to do it through the use of mini publics. So that's one thing. Now, let me tell you about Iceland. Iceland precisely went through a total crisis at all levels in 2008. Total financial collapse, economic collapse. 7 times the GDP was burned over a couple of weeks. So, of course, politicians were kicked out. Some were sent to jail. It's probably the only country where 2008, was taken that seriously and people had to pay the price of their corruption. So they decided, okay, now it's time to rewrite our social contract around values that were not just imported from the Danish monarchy when they got their independence from it in 1944. So we're gonna take this moment to think really about what we want and the kind of society we wanna be. And so the first thing they did is convene 950 randomly selected citizens to basically brainstorm about that question and shape the agenda of a constitutional assembly, literal council. Then not only did they do that, they started with consulting a somewhat representative sample of the people, but they elected 25 people from a pool of non-politicians. By law, politicians were excluded from running for that campaign, for that election. So the 25 were relatively ordinary people compared to the typical pool of constitution makers and politicians. And they came up with a really, innovative draft, itself informed by the input of a larger crowd of people on the internet and in the larger public, because they used crowdsourcing methods to basically get their drafts commented on at regular intervals for about 11 weeks. Then finally, they put that document to the approval of the public in a referendum in 2012. 2/3 of the voting population voted for it and said, yes, this needs to be the basis of our new social contract, let's go for it. They even approved the more controversial articles around collectivization of natural resources that were not already privately owned. But somehow, when the text went back to Parliament to be finally passed into law, Parliament stalled and refused to vote on it. So that tells you something about the cause of the problems and the impediments to the solution, I think. It also tells you that we can envision very open-ended, inclusive, participatory constitutional processes that can even in turn, in my view, be a model for the way we should make the law on an ordinary daily sort of level.
Jan, let me bring you in. What are your thoughts on citizens' assemblies or sort of movements of the likes of which Hélène was just referring to?
Depends on what they're empowered to do. So if they have an advisory capacity, sure. If on very specific questions where we have reason to believe that parties, because of self-interest, might not decide in ways which citizens find attractive and legitimate and that are compatible with basic democratic commitments to equality and freedom, absolutely. But of course, the proposal by some of our colleagues is more radical, namely really to basically replace elections and parties and parliaments altogether. And I think that's not a good idea, because as many people in this meeting know much better than I do, elections and parties have lots and lots of problems. But at least people know roughly what to do. And we can, to some degree, improve the conditions under which parties and elections operate. If we give all power to randomly selected citizens, and I'm not selected, I'm not sure what I should do next. And if the answer is, oh, but then you can still demonstrate, or we're going to have a referendum about the outcome of what the Citizens' Assembly decided, we basically are on a slippery slope back to a party system as we know it, without any of the advantages. And the idea that, well, these randomly selected citizens might not be captured by special interests, or they couldn't be influenced by bureaucracies, as much as current politicians can, that case remains to be made. There are good reasons to believe that actually some of these pathologies would be even worse, because these randomly selected citizens, they're not going to be up for re-election. There are no basic accountability mechanisms in place. So I worry that this is sometimes presented as a panacea, and that it is not.
I'm going to let Hélène respond. One of the great things about a discussion like this is we get to explore and examine potential tweaks or solutions or alternatives. And I can't stress how important that is, because again, let's remind ourselves why we're here. We're discussing whether democracy is really in crisis, and if so, how bad it is. So with that spirit in mind, Hélène, let's have you refute what Jan was just saying, and also feel free to bring up, I guess, the example of your home country, France, because there, of course, there are deliberative citizen processes that are replacing legislatures, but on specific issues. So, for example, the Citizens Convention for Climate, not replacing legislatures, but sort of making recommendations on it. Tell us a bit about that.
I'm not going to refute Jan, because I think he's right that I'm not a revolutionary in that sense. I'm giving you a sort of vision for what I think, if we had started from scratch, would look more like a democracy to me. But of course, there's very little empirical evidence of the viability of such a system, because it doesn't exist. We had sort of proto-version in ancient Greece. We have elements of it here and there in the Icelandic process, in the 400 deliberative mini-publics that have been run around the world at this point, but there's no existing system that's like that. So I totally appreciate Jan's caution about not overthrowing the current system and just replacing it wholesale. But that said, I think it's important to have an ambitious vision when we think of reforms, because otherwise you get stuck in what's called participatory washing. If you really go just for let's just play around with these mini publics here and there, we just give them advisory powers, nothing happens. I mean, this was kind of the case, even in Iceland, where the constitutional process was taken seriously, nothing happened in the end. In British Columbia in 2004, nothing happened in the end. In France, sadly, again, this Convention for Climate is amazing and was an amazing experiment. Brought together, randomly selected citizens to come up with bold recommendations on how to curb greenhouse gas emissions, and try to fix climate change, from the French perspective. But in the end, the French government, at most, I think, endorsed 15% of the recommendations, which is really disappointing. So I just think that since we're going to move potentially towards a hybrid solution, we have to keep in mind that the point is just to fix things at the margin and sprinkle a little bit of participation here and there. It's truly to really rethink where the center of gravity of democracy is. And to me, elected officials should have the humility to recognize that they may not be the best democratic representatives there are out there. They're doing an amazing job, they're doing the best they can, but because of the nature of their selection, the selection mechanisms through which they have access to power, they end up being a skewed sample of the population, overly educated, urban, wealthy, male, white, etc., etc. It's true everywhere you look. And so with humility, you need to see that and wonder whether we shouldn't create institutions that can at least, fix that representation problem, but then these solutions need to be empowered. So I think advisory functions are not enough, and at some point parliaments will have to delegate power willingly, smartly, because this will only enhance the legitimacy of the whole system and make them more meaningful and more appreciated in the function that they actually serve.
Well, I'm sure there are hundreds of parliamentarians, thousands probably listening to you right now as you call for more humility. Martin, this is a good moment to bring you in as well. I'm going to begin to now move us more towards talking about solutions, fixes, reforms. And one of the sort of bucket areas I wanted to bring up was polarization. Now, obviously, Jan, Hélène, and I, we're all currently in the United States. And it's very common here to discuss how the two main parties are almost irrevocably sort of polarized. And that polarization is getting worse. and it makes democracy function less effectively. But what about the rest of the world, especially in multi-party democracies, for example, in India? I'm hoping you can broaden the lens for us a little bit to give us a sense of how bad polarization is globally, but also what can we do about it?
Yeah, well, I think I wonder whether the bipartisan system that is prevalent in the United States is the best form of democratic expression, especially so, as you yourself have pointed out, the high level of polarization. For us, I think diversity is the name of the game. I think that whatever democratic dispensation we have should reflect the diversity of society, not only in terms of the demographic composition of society, but also in terms of the interests that these various segments of society have. This has to be captured in any system, especially in parliament. It is not always the case, and we have during this conversation pointed to the fact that electoral processes, electoral systems are not perfect. They do not always give us the desired results. And that is where I think we need to correct when it comes to fulfilling the representation criteria of democracy, that it is not only in terms of numbers, but also in terms of quality, in terms of the ability to capture the diverse interests of society. And that is why in many countries, we see institutions that come out of electoral processes. Other institutions have been put in place in order to close that gap between electoral outcomes and the real and diversified interests of society. You have second chambers of parliament that are created, that are appointed, made up of different groups of society. You have, even in some systems, the Economic and Social Council that represents the different socio-economic groups that provide guidance to the legislative body. But at the end of the day, I think that the name of the game is enforceability. And I do not think that we can give full power to citizen movements, because in the constitutional scheme of things, they are not empowered to take decisions that are enforceable on the rest of society. So they may have some degree of legitimacy in terms of expressing the people's interests and concerns, but they may not have the power that is required to put in place policies that are enforceable and are applicable to the society as a whole. And that is where we think that the parliaments, as I would say in French, incontournable, they are unavoidable. They are the people who would have the power and legitimacy, hoping that the electoral process is more or less fair and equitable. They are the people who are called upon to make laws that apply to the rest of society and can represent society as a whole. This is not perfect. And again, it is up to parliaments to continue to work at reforming electoral processes, in reforming systems that would allow for better representation of the diverse interests of society. At the end of the day, we are saying that a good democratic system is one that is inclusive, representative, accountable, and accessible. But now, in this day and age, maybe we want to think of alternative forms of bringing in more representation. We're talking about more women in parliaments. We're talking about the need to bring in the youth into the discussion, the conversation, because it has been recognized. And our statistics show that young people are very much left out of mainstream political processes. Only 2.6% of the world's parliamentarians are under the age of 30. And this is unacceptable, given that
right, and more than half the world's population is under the age of 30.
They make up about 60% of the world's population, but they have only 2.6% of representation in parliament. So those type of things, I think we can put together in a package of reforms that parliaments need to stimulate in order to perfect democracy and its implementation.
Can I just push you, Martin, on the youth issue? So what kind of a reform would you recommend then to change that imbalance? Because, I mean, less than approximately 3% under 30 in parliaments versus 60% in the general population. That doesn't sound good to me. What would you do?
I think that there are measures that have been implemented over the years that have proven their worth. I mean, when we have talked about gender equality, there are measures that have been put in place that have helped to drive up the number of women in governing structures. Quotas, for instance. Why can't we apply quotas for parliamentary membership of young people and say, well, let's start with 15% of young people in parliament and hope that we can arrive at a critical mass where youth can then begin to make an impact on groups. We can talk of reserved seats, but more importantly, I think that parliaments and legislatures in general have to put in place youth-friendly policies. They need to be seen to be capturing the interest of the young people, whether it is with the young people sitting around the table formally, or whether it is reaching out to them through processes of consultation to make sure that the voices of young people are being heard in the mainstream political processes. Otherwise, you lose them, you let them go out into the streets and you don't know what happens there. You need structured democracy, but not restricted democracy, so to speak. You need a system that is flexible enough to reach out to these stakeholders and make sure that they're at the table for their voice to be heard. And I think that people are not, just as we are talking about gender equality, nobody today is challenging the need to empower young people, both politically and economically and otherwise. I think they need to be at the table. And that is a work for parliaments. And we are very glad at the IPU to be championing this movement, which is very young. Our youth movement is just over 10 years old, but it's making an impact in the sense that there is an aggregation of young parliamentarians who prove that it is possible to bring on board young people and bring about effective and successful change in society.
I'm gonna, in a few moments, move to bring in some of our audience questions that are coming in. We also have a taped message from a member of parliament in Myanmar. But before I do that, Jan, I wanted to ask you sort of to segue from polarization to youth to now protest movements, because, you know, in any sort of democracy, a simple protest can be such a powerful democratic message, but even those seem to have changed in the last decade or so. I mean, with the rise of strongman populists, it's become easier for authoritarian leaders or populists to simply say, oh, well, those protesters are anarchists, or, you know, those people there, they're part of the fake media opposition. How do we combat that?
Allow me maybe to just add one more word about polarization, because especially, but not only in the US, there's been a sort of tendency to say, oh, polarization is so horrible, we're so divided, we all must come together. And then you sort of slide towards saying it's only democracy if everything is quiet and everybody is super civil and nice. And that's not true. I mean, as you, again, all know better than I do, democracy is conflict, is legitimate conflict, is also contained conflict. And the problem is not that people disagree. The problem is that in some countries, particular parties and actors basically start saying the other side is fundamentally illegitimate and we are never going to accept losing an election. I mean, that is exactly what we've seen in the United States. It's not that both parties are doing that. It's not a symmetrical process. It's one party that at least partially has turned against absolute democratic basics, such as accepting a legitimate opposition, accepting that a minority has its say, even if a majority ultimately has to get its way, and so on. So very basic stuff that is no longer really respected. And that clearly is dangerous. So protests as such can play an important role in countering these tendencies. But as you say, and again, this might sort of align a little bit with what I was trying to say earlier, authoritarians have also become smarter in terms of trying to delegitimate protests. Arguably, Vladimir Putin, who is not necessarily a populist in my view, sort of pioneered this idea of saying that, look, you know, what looks like genuine civil society protest is nothing of the sort. These are basically fake citizens. It's all been paid for, engineered, arranged for by somebody on the outside. And, we all know the usual suspects who can be trotted out on these occasions. So it's Soros, it's the CIA, but there are no limits to creativity. Some of you maybe remember how around the time of the Gezi Park protests in Istanbul, some people came out and said, look, this only looks like it's real protest against what's happening in the center of the city. It's, of course, all been arranged by, as everybody knows, of course, by the German airline Lufthansa, because they're so afraid of the new competition from Turkish Airlines, given the great new airports that Erdogan has built, and so on and so forth. So you can always come up with stories like this. Obviously, if the media has been captured, it's more difficult to counter these things. If it's more difficult to have protests on the street, it's more difficult to counter these things. But maybe on a less obvious note, I think there's also a particular burden on journalists, let's say, in contexts where the media has not been captured yet, to sort of find the right line between, on the one hand, sort of treating whatever is left by way of normal democratic politics as such, and to say, look, the government says this, the opposition says that, and we're just reporting to you what's going on. That's different from those moments when democracy itself really is at stake. And then it's important exactly not to paint the symmetrical picture of polarization and say, oh, they say this and they say that. Then it's important for journalists themselves to basically say, no, the one side is saying something that is simply untrue or that is questioning democracy itself, which, by the way, is, of course, also the foundation for journalists' own work. So far, so good, even though obviously not easy. What makes it even more difficult, in a certain way, is that one should also not fall into the opposite trap. That was the trap that the likes of Stephen Bannon and Trump himself, to some degree, who, whatever else you think about him, was very good at playing the media and news organizations, also said for journalists. When, remember, they said, oh, the media is, of course, just the opposition. And then journalists, under certain circumstances, might be tempted to say, yes, we are the heroes of the resistance. And our job now is to oppose a government on absolutely everything. And that, in my humble view, is a mistake too, because then you kind of confirm the story that, yeah, journalists are all partisan. And that, of course, in advance discredits whatever they say or write. So it's a very fine line. And that's my pitch also for why democratic theory matters. It can all seem terribly abstract, but ultimately it has to translate into an ability to find that red line between normal democratic conflict and those moments when the basics are really at stake. And I think that's what politicians have to be able to articulate. That's what journalists have to be able to articulate. And that's what citizens, on occasion, certainly, have to be able to make plausible when they say, look, I'm not saying the government is always illegitimate, but now is the moment to go out there and really get engaged because the basics are at risk. So that's my 2 cents worth on this.
No, that's it's a very good set of points, Jan. And I'll just add, as the only journalist on this panel today, it's hard. And these are questions that we mull all the time. I've lived and worked as a journalist on 3 continents. And, one thing that we constantly grapple with is the role of technology and echo chambers, where, we don't choose who we reach. There are basic sort of blank spots, blank spaces in vast parts of the world where, journalists who are just trying to do the right thing can't reach. And that's become a bigger problem, an escalating problem over the last 10 or 15 years, where it's become much harder to be a journalist, much harder to cut through the noise. Before we go to a bit of tape we have from Myanmar, I just wanted to bring in Hélène. Hélène, I noticed you were furiously taking notes, so I just want to give you a quick chance to respond or say anything you'd like to before we move to our Myanmarese guest.
Yes, I was thinking that youth representation is really key, because if you look at the main issues of the day, we, past generation, even the current generation, we're wrecking the planet, and we're leaving, things for the young generation to deal with without consulting them, pretty much. Pandemic, we've sacrificed the youth, which was the least vulnerable to the coronavirus, to save the lives of older people. Where is the gratitude? Where is the redistribution? Where is the voice? So you look at the leader of the free world, Biden, close to 80. how is that going to speak for the 60% of the population that's young and unrepresented? So I think there are really structural problems. And I think that if you blow that up to the global level and you imagine a global parliament based on election, you get the same problem. It's going to be a plutocracy, a gerontocracy, and it's not going to be good governance. So I just really want to emphasize that, because I know I put that out as a provocation, but we have to worry about the implications of that mode of selection for democratic representatives. Because if you look, Martin said the youth is not present in the mainstream institution of politics, but they are out there on the internet. The Me Too movement, it's them. The Black Lives Matter movement, it's them. So they make things happen, but through channels we're just, the regular political institutions are do not seem to be connecting with. I mean, they connect with eventually, but there should be a way to bring them in. And quotas, sure, quotas are better than nothing, but who do you bring in with quotas? A very self-selected sample of people who have access, who have connections, who are already charismatic, educated. That's not going to be the shepherd in Afghanistan who cannot read. I mean, and yet these are voices. If we are true Democrats, if we really care about people and we really think every life has the same value as every other life, then why aren't these people present in the room where momentous decisions are made for their future and that of their children? So I just want to push a little bit the cursor towards more radicalness, because I think we're kind of stuck in the old paradigms. We're very self-satisfied with the status quo, and we think we can just tweak it at the margin. But I just don't think we're at a moment in history where tweaking at the margin is going to cut it. So I just wanted to put that out there.
It's an important call to have to do much more than tweak at the margins. I need to now bring in some of our parliamentarians from around the world. There are several of you who are joining us live who I want to come to. Before I do that, however, I want to hear from U Aung Ki Nunt, Myanmar's head of the committee representing the Lutao. We wanted him to join us live, but he's currently moving locations for security reasons. So the IPU agreed to tape a short comment from him. Let's listen in to this tape. La traduction.
Dear colleagues from IPU and all other parliamentary, I am U Aung Ki Nunt, the members of Myanmar Parliament, and also serving as the chair of CRPH. I am really honored for your invitation to speak about the situation in Myanmar, a situation that is anything but democratic, a situation where the peoples have declared military dictatorship must end and democracy must rise up. Therefore, I must make a plea for help for the people of Myanmar. I seek to amplify their voices, harden in their call for freedom, their call for a federal democratic union, and their call for action from those who can act. My plea then is to ask you to continue to do all that you can do, to work with us, to stand with us in solidarity, to stay with us on our journey to federal democratic government. As we resist with all our might military dictatorship that besieges our country to continue our long and tortuous path to democracy. Too many Myanmar peoples have paid their ultimate price, dying for their belief in democracy, to be governed, not ruled. As we gather together to make International Day of Democracy, at the same time, 193 member states of the United Nations gather in New York, having an annual General Assembly sessions. The people of Myanmar are seeking the continued accreditations of Myanmar's permanent representative to the United Nations HEU John Mouton. We ask you to have your government support this to support democracy. As we gather together here, I must report that in Myanmar, from the 1st of February military coup, 1,089 people have been killed. 8,128 people are arrested. 6,447 are detained or sentenced. 1,984 are evading arrest warrants. Statistics are stuck, but these statistics tell stories of tragedy and trauma. of families ripped apart, society slipping into an abyss. The sufferings of so many is immense. The mental well-being of so many people destroyed. In modern times of began our democratic journey in 1947, interrupted in 1958, denied by the 1962 military coup d'etat, with democracy never raising its head until the 1990 election, as it did, although constrained in 2010, 2015, and 2020. Each time, the peoples have freedom to choose their government. They chose democratic, but had it stolen each time, most cruelly in 1990, where MPs were imprisoned, debarred from elections, and this is being repeated now with the February 1 military coup. We are currently trapped by one man, Jan-Werner Mueller, by his self-constructed, self-serving ideology that he prevailed for over half a century. One that keeps a small group of the military elites to power, where they plunder the state's resources and declare that only they can govern and hold the country together. Yet it is under their rule that the country has become impoverished. Several wars have raged against the ethnic nationalities for some 72 years, and where peace and prosperity remained elusive. This one man, Jan-Werner Mueller, hold our country to ransom, our population hostage to his thirst for power, power without legitimacy, power without accountability, and power held at the point of the gun. We had a taste of what democracy could be over the past decade. We believed that the parliamentary system would give us our best opportunity to bring democracy to life, and we experienced how it can do just that. Nowhere is democracy more desired than where it is denied, and that is the story of Myanmar. Everywhere democracy prevails, it must be protected at every threat, and it can be done so through strong and resilient parliament. Parliament is proven to be the best buffer against the erosions of democracy. This IPU panel discussions on democracy with such erudite scholars and our foreign policy expert moderator is an ideal setting to make my plea for the peoples of Myanmar and an opportunity to listen and learn about how to achieve and sustain democracy. Again, thank you very much for giving Myanmar a spot on this event.
We were glad there to hear from Uong Ki Nunt, Myanmar's head of the committee representing the Tall. Poignant words from him. He said, quote, "Nowhere is democracy more desired than where it is denied. Nowhere is democracy more desired than where it is denied. And that is the story of Myanmar," his words. Incidentally, there was a minor victory for democracy in Myanmar this week, as first reported by my magazine, Foreign Policy, when the United States and China this week brokered an agreement to block Myanmar's military rulers from addressing the UN General Assembly next week, dealing a blow of sorts to the junta's quest for international legitimacy. You can read more about that on foreignpolicy.com. I'd like to bring now some more questions from our audience, especially our parliamentarians from around the world. And I'll take them together back to back. And our panel, who you heard from earlier, will take notes, and then we'll try and address all of them together in the time that we have left, about 30 minutes. So I'd like to bring in first our senator from Canada, Ms. Salma Ataulajan. If you can hear me, ma'am, we'd love to take your question. And I request everyone to keep their questions relatively short so that we can get through enough of them. Senator from Canada, please.
Thank you, Ravi. I hope you can hear me. So I would I would like to thank the IPU for organizing this very timely and important discussion. I would like to, take attention to Afghanistan as someone who grew up in that part of the world, and what's been happening. I've been very involved, just dealing with some of the MPs that I knew and some of the women that I knew who worked in NGOs. So my question to the panel is that many Afghans do not share Western government's definition of democracy, as it is perceived as an imported concept of Western liberal values, and secularism or is even associated with the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan in the 1980s. Considering the actual state of democracy in Afghanistan following the withdrawal of the US troops, what do you believe would have been theoretically happened to Afghanistan if outside international forces hadn't invaded the country 20 years ago? And my second part of the question is, how can we continue to promote democratic values and practices without trying to enforce a Western approach that might be, not considered appropriate or conducive to their reality?
Thank you, Ms. Salma Tolajan, Senator from Canada. Good set of questions there. I'd like to bring, and we're going to try and take a few more together. We'll take notes and I'll put these all to our panelists so they can address them together. So next, I'd like to call on a parliamentarian from Nepal, Ms. Bimla Rai Paudyal. If we can hear from you, please.
Good evening, everyone. I just wanted to make a few comments on the presentations. For me, I represent Nepal.
We'd prefer to take questions, please, if you will.
Yeah, for the questions also, I have one question related to media. What I have seen in Nepal and in many developing countries is that the role of media, especially the social media, which is so uncontrolled nowadays, the social media is becoming very, very important to shape the future of democracy. While in many cases, social media and freedom of expression has contributed to make the parliament and bureaucracy more accountable and the state more accountable. But sometimes it also creates a lot of havoc, especially when some influential media house prefer some political parties and take their sides and make the issues. How do we ensure that the media is free from bias and freedom of expression and does not create the negativity and pessimism against the democracy in a country that is just starting, practicing democratic values? That's one of the worries that we have. Another worry is election has become very, very expensive, especially in developing countries again. And election is far from reach of poor, far from reach of women, and many marginalized groups. Because election is very expensive, political parties now need to attract so many business communities as well as so many interest groups who are elites. And they often, even the parliament, they often need to make decisions that favors not the ordinary public, but more favoring to the interest groups who have invested in election. How to make this balance and how to make political parties themselves more democratic in nature. So these are some of the concerns that we have. Maybe some of the panelists would answer them. Thank you.
These are terrific questions. Ms. Bimla Rai Paudyal, parliamentarian from Nepal. She asked about the role of social media, what happens when influential media prefers a particular party, how to create a media free from bias, and also the role of money in elections. We haven't yet discussed campaign finance reform, but we will try to get to that. Thank you, our parliamentarian from Nepal. And then I'm going to bring in one more person before I try and come back to our panel, Mr. Jacques Craval. He is a French parliamentarian and Secretary General of APF. Sir, the floor is yours.
Merci à vous, c'est l'APF, l'Assemblée parlementaire.
Thank you very much. So it's APF, the General Assembly for Francophonie. I don't really have a question, but I wanted to contribute to the debate. First of all, I wanted to thank the IPU for its fight for the Francophonie, for the French-speaking community in these trying times. Although we must remain optimistic, it's true that democracy is all about will, but we need weapons to be able to fight. So we've talked about institutions. Institutions must be reformed. But I think beyond that, there's the issue of citizens. There's no democracy without democrats, and there are no democrats and leaders without citizens. So I believe we should educate everywhere in the world to citizenship. Citizenship is not natural, is something that we need to learn. And we have been faced with this issue in the French-speaking community. The rule of law must also be learned, and this is actually a question that was raised during the summit for Sahel. We must fight against violence, against terrorism everywhere. But if we don't fight against the everyday violence, then we won't be able to fight and protect our system. So this was my output in the name of my institution. So we need to focus on education and culture. Today, culture is not considered as a structural element of democracy. Our motto is diversity, respect of diversity for universality of rights. So this is our motto. We need to reinvent democracy. We need to shape democracy thanks to citizens. We need to take heed to citizens. We need to reform institutions to have fluid, open institutions. Thank you very much, IPU, and you can rely upon my institutions to shape the French-speaking community, the Francophonie, as well as democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you there. That was Mr. Jacques Craval, French parliamentarian, Secretary General of APF. Let me bring our panelists back in because we've heard now several comments, many questions as well. So I'm going to call back in Hélène, Jan, and Martin. I'm not going to throw specific questions at you, so I'm just going to see if any of you would like to take some of those questions on. Hélène, why don't I start with you? Were there any questions there you'd like to address first to start?
These were really difficult questions. I'm not going to engage in some counterfactual history of a country like Afghanistan that I know too little about. I just think that, to me, you change people through example rather than through imposition of norms. And apart from Germany and Japan, historically, I'm not sure we've been very successful at exporting forcefully our institutions. And in fact, I've become convinced that when we export our institutions, we export, the wrong ones at this point. So I think we should be a lot more humble. And what could have happened in Afghanistan if it had not been for this 20-year-long war? Really, I have no idea. I just think that, if you read David Stasavich's very good book about democracy worldwide, and you see that there are various ways to implement or express the principles of community, equality, freedom that Martin was talking about. And there are Gram Sabha's meetings in India, and there are all these town meetings in the US classically, but in every region in the world can find, I'm sure, the sort of like prototype of a more democratic decision making. So I think they should start there, looking at their own institutions and practices and traditions, and build on those rather than necessarily look to the West. Even if I think that this is a universal value, actually, democracy. But and then on the questions of one thing that I found very moving in the representative of Myanmar's call is that you know, it's humbling for me in a way, because it reminds me that, you know, I can call for a more radical vision of democracy, but people don't take one, like the next thing on the list, which is not to be governed rather than subjected, as he put it. That said, to be governed, it's not exactly to be ruling either. So I just want to mention that, yes, it's better to have the rule of law, it's better to have liberal rights, it's better to have minority protections and all these things, but it's still not democracy. So I'm just saying that because the bar is lower in other countries doesn't mean we should have a high bar in the countries where we already have those freedoms and benefits. And then the last point on the democratization of parties. To the extent that we're going to have to work with what we have, and parties are probably, as Jan said, here to stay, I do think that democratization of the inner logic and governance of parties is a great place to start. They should be more deliberative, more inclusive, more, less hierarchical and based on sort of like feudal sort of logics. I would also say that if we're going to think about social media are not like natural objects that emerge, you know, spontaneously. That they're structured by certain decisions. They're the product of certain logics in corporate firms like Facebook, like Google. So we have to think about the governance of those places as well, right? Because that's where the action is now. Some governments are actually much smaller and less powerful, and parliaments are less funded than the R&D branch of a place like Facebook. So why don't we start thinking about what does democracy mean there, and why should we apply those principles so that engineers and regular folks can have a say about the design of algorithms, the biases that we inject in them, the way we prioritize profit making and clickbait over education and dissemination of correct information, things like that. I think that's also something that should be on the table.
Martin, let me get a quick comment from you as well in response, and then I'm going to try and bring in a couple more parliamentarians who are waiting to speak.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ravi. I just want very quickly to respond to Senator Taulajan to say that I think that the issue is not the imposition of a system on the Afghans. I think that we are all subscribed to the universal values of democracy, human rights, freedom of expression, as embodied in the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What is happening is that we are using institutions that may not be adapted to the host community and superimposing this on them. Upon hindsight, maybe we could have done things differently in Afghanistan instead of insisting that, for example, the parliamentary institution should look like a Congress in the United States. I think that we could have dug deeper into the traditions and culture of Afghanistan and find institutions that embody the legislative arm of state and see whether we can develop those to become full-fledged legislative institutions in Afghanistan. So these are the lessons that we have learned, that the values are there. The values cannot be termed to be Western values. They are values that we have all subscribed to, but the institutions may differ from context to context, depending on the country where we are, and we need to be sensitive to that.
Indeed, we do. Jan, I'm going to bring you in right after we hear from two more parliamentarians, and then I'll give you a chance to respond to them, but also your thoughts more broadly. So let's bring in a representative from Turkey and then also from Tunisia. So first, Dr. Rabza Kavachi Khan from Turkey, if you can unmute yourself, and a quick question, please. Again, we're almost out of time, so if you can keep your questions or brief comments very brief, please. Dr. Khan.
Thank you so much. I hope you're able to hear me.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to just start with Myanmar. I really appreciate the fact that we got an opportunity to listen to the representative from Myanmar. But when we think about Myanmar, we also need to think of the Rohingya Muslims who have been denied citizenship. They've been going through massacres there. And this happened, unfortunately, under the previous government. So when we talk about democracy, human life is more important than democracy. We also need to be critical of the situation there as well. It is the citizens and countries who should decide for themselves. So I agree that there shouldn't be any imposition. There shouldn't be any Orientalist imposition of certain values by anyone to another country. So this is important. I'm happy that it was mentioned about digital democracy. I think this is the most important issue we would be talking about rather than what democracy is. Nobody has a right to define a certain type of democracy, tailor a certain type of democracy on anyone. But when we talk about digital democracy, I wasn't particularly in favor of Trump, but we know that his account is still withdrawn by Facebook, but Taliban is able to tweet. So there is a lot of hypocrisy out there. So that these are the things we need to also consider.
Sure.
Gezi Park incidents were mentioned. It is sad that Gezi Party got a lot of coverage. The protest there got a lot of coverage, but the coup attempt in Turkey, 251 people lost their lives in 2016 by news media. And I know that you have a very difficult job, Ravi, as a journalist. So I think this is also important to note that when we have Occupy Wall Street, we had them in the protest, and we had the Gilets jaunes protesting in France. Interestingly, some of the protests are covered very deliberately, very in detail, but some of them are not mentioned. So I don't think we should have an Orientalist perspective or an Occidentalist perspective. We are all equals. Nobody has a right to define what another country needs, but it's the people who need to define.
Dr. Dr. Khan, I'm going to have to...
Yes.
Dr. Khan, I'm going to have to cut you off because
some countries are not able to express themselves because they don't get that opportunity. So I think it's important that everybody has a voice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. I hear you, and I agree with you. I agree that the media does not need an Orientalist perspective, as you put it. I myself, of course, am from India. We also have another speaker from Tunisia. Before I get to him, I just want to flag a question that I thought was very interesting in the Zoom chat. This is from Austin. Let me see, Austin Cospel. And his question is, what about partnership building between national parliaments and technology firms to increase the responsiveness of parliaments to their constituencies? Would a more accessible legislature raise trust in government? Good question for our panelists. Before we get back to our panelists, I think our final comment / question from a member of the audience, Mr. Rashid Kanouchi, Speaker of the Tunisian Parliament. Sir, if you can unmute yourself. Again, quick thoughts from you, sir, because we're almost out of time.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, friends. First, on International Democracy Day, I am delighted to congratulate you all on this occasion. And also, I thank the IPU for allowing me this opportunity to talk about what is happening in Tunisia today. Since the 25th of July, 2021, when President Kais Saied announced a number of exceptional measures, freezing parliament, lifting the immunity of these elected MPs, and dissolving the government. All of these, which is in violation of the Constitution and not part of his prerogatives. He further declared a state of emergency, and consequently, fundamental human rights have been violated, including the freedom of press. There has been MPs placed under house arrest, MPs arrested, a large number of business people have been prevented from leaving the country. Fear has spread in the country. This is the general situation in Tunisia today. And under Democrat situation, suspicion of the constitution and obstruction of the Tunisian democracy transition, which is distinguished around the world. I call you friends, distinguished friends, to stand by this through its light. We are certain that Tunisia will regain its democracy, inshallah. And this is a unique democracy in the Arab world. This candle will continue to shine, and Tunisia's jasmine will never dry up. God willing. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Mr. Ghannouchi, for those thoughts from your perch out there in Tunisia. We wish you well. Let me bring back our panelists for closing thoughts. That's Martin Chungong, Hélène Landemore, Jan-Werner Mueller. Jan, I wasn't able to come to you earlier, so let me give you a chance to respond now to some of the questions you've just heard or comments or from earlier in the session. Go ahead.
If I may, I'll just make two quick points about social media.
Please.
As you all know, we've sort of swung from one extreme, where the revolution was going to be tweeted, Facebook was going to mean democratic liberation everywhere, etc., to a tendency to basically blame social media for all our pathologies in our democracy, with some of our colleagues now writing things like Facebook equals fascism. And two things I think are worth bearing in mind to avoid this kind of defeatism. One is that at least from what we now know empirically, and we know still far too little, given that these technology companies, of course, are not accessible to researchers in a way that other media institutions would be. But given what we know now, it seems that there has been what you might call an echo chamber about echo chambers. In other words, we all sort of told each other the story about filter bubbles and, oh no, it's terrible that everybody is in their homogeneous world, which sounds completely plausible to everybody, but empirically might actually not be that plausible. And our online lives might actually be much more diverse than our offline lives in certain ways. Now, for democracy, normatively, morally, that's neither here nor there. But at least it should sort of blunt this outright defeatism along the lines of, oh, everybody has disappeared to their own world. There's nothing we can do. That's point number one. Point number two is that at least if you think of the most egregious examples of, the spread of conspiracy thinking, Hillary Clinton is running a pedophilia ring underneath a pizzeria in Washington, et cetera, et cetera. What we also now know is that these outcomes are not due to the fact that millions of people are just sitting there ready to spread fake news. It has a lot more to do with the pre-existing structures of our public spheres and media environments. It's a complicated story, but to make things short, these sorts of outcomes, at least in the US, have a lot more to do with regulatory decisions about cable and radio, which, by the way, is the medium with which Americans still spend most time overall, than with the internet, which in a sense came on top of these pre-existing structures, but which is not single-handedly responsible. No technology implements itself. So I would back and echo Hélène's point about the need for regulation. Obviously, that's very cheap to say, but I think we're slowly inching to a better understanding that it's not the technology itself. We can separate the technology from business models. We can regulate business models. We've done these things before. It's not an impossible thing to think about. And that's something that I think could also be a matter where citizens, again, I would echo Hélène, could have a lot of impact. After all, this is something they live with. They have a lot of direct experience with. And so I would also, in a sense, support what I think somebody came up with in the chat in terms of saying, look, parliaments can involve citizens in these discussions much more plausibly than maybe in some other areas. Thank you.
No, that's a great point. And, one mustn't forget that, the United States is a country that repealed net neutrality a few years ago. Of course, now it is trying, tech regulation and discussions around that are a major topic of discussion in Washington, D.C. So watch that space because I know the United States is looking to learn from Europe, at least, on some of these things. I'm going to take closing thoughts now from our other panelists. Hélène, I'll start with you, and then we'll close with Martin. Hélène, over to you.
I just want to thank the panelists and the questions, and I think there's so much more to be said. I think on the role of social media and digital technologies, I would also, like Jan, end on a hopeful note. I think we're here together because of the miracle of technology. As I mentioned in the chat, there are very, very interesting things being done in Taiwan for a couple of years now that, show that you can involve ordinary citizens in policy making around issues like the regulation of Uber and Airbnb and how to manage the stock of masks in a pandemic in an efficient way. And so there's a lot of things that can be done that provide good governance and service delivery to the citizens, and they are made cheap by social media and digital technologies. So I think that's one thing. Another thing I want to say is that I really think that a frontier of democratic theory, and I think reforms going forward, are really corporations and the governance structure. I totally agree with what Jan said about regulating the business model, shaping them, creating incentives that transform the way technology is designed. And so it's going to be a very important question when it comes to artificial intelligence, among other things. And so I invite you, and this is a plug for something I'm a part of, but I have to do it. This is a global forum on democratizing work that's going to take place at the beginning of October 5 to 7. And I really warmly encourage you all to show up. We have incredible speakers from all around the globe. This is just the beginning of a new chapter for me. And I think this is something that should be on the radar of people like you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Hélène. I strongly urge everyone watching to go out and buy the books by both Hélène Landemore and Jan. That's Open Democracy, Democracy Rules. You might agree or disagree with some of the ideas and proposals in there. But again, the spirit of today's debate is that only by engaging, we think of new things and we learn of new ideas and new reforms. We see things in a different way. And there's also the idea of humility, which several of our panelists have mentioned. So please do go out and buy those books. Martin, I'm going to come to you for the last word. We're almost out of time, so just a minute, but take us to air.
Thank you again, Ravi. I think that the current pandemic has proven the point that there is need to bring technology to parliaments, to democracy, make technology work for parliaments. We have seen that thanks to technology, parliaments have remained open for business. So now how do we harness this potential and make it accessible to the cross-section of the global community is the challenge that we face. But some of the takeaways from this conversation we've just had include the fact that I think we're all agreed that there is eroding trust in democracy, its processes and institutions. There is a need to regain this trust and legitimacy. And what we want to do is to make sure that democracy is working for all. Democracy is addressing the needs of society, a cross-section of society. And for that to happen, some institutions that have the power, like Parliament, should introduce reforms to on the practices and policies of democracy to make them younger, bring in younger faces, make them more diversified and all-encompassing. That's what I understand. But at the end of the day, we are saying that we cannot take democracy for granted. It is fragile. It needs to be protected. It needs to be nurtured every day. It needs to be diversified so that it serves the interest of all. And my parting word is that democracy is like the phoenix, the legendary phoenix that will always rise from its ashes. Democracy will be there always. If we were in a dictatorial, authoritarian setting, maybe all of us would leave from here and go straight to jail, but not in a democratic setting, which is a very heartening thing to know. Thank you very much, Ravi.
Thank you. That's a lovely optimistic note on which to end, especially since we began this 90-minute discussion talking about how much of a crisis democracy is in. Martin Chungong, Secretary General of the Inter-Parliamentary Union. Thank you, Jan-Werner Mueller, a professor at Princeton and the author of Democracy Rules, and Hélène Landemore, professor at Yale, author of Open Democracy. Again, please do go buy their books. The IPU will place a recording of this event online, and I'm sure you'll be able to find it on their website as well as all of their social channels. I'd like to thank again our terrific panelists for giving us their time, Jan, Hélène, Martin, their time and their valuable insights. I'd also like to thank the IPU and all the MPs, UN partners, students, and the general public who've joined us today on the International Day of Democracy. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Editor-in-Chief of Foreign Policy Magazine. Thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your week.